Hey everyone, and welcome to this. This is our week 6 installation of your very exciting, fun-filled class, Politics 1010. And this week, in continuing with working our way through our syllabus, we are talking about media and American politics. And it's an important topic. There's actually tons we can say about this, more than we could possibly cover in just an hour or an hour and 20 minutes. And you'll have to forgive me as well. There's a little bit of background noise here today because of construction going on in the area where I am. But if you'll be patient with me, I'll try to do my best for you and work my way through this. So, first of all, I think the thing to sort of keep in mind talking about American politics, and this will be a theme that I'll be working through, is that, American politics is a politics, American media, rather, influences politics largely through the fact that it is corporately owned. That is to say, it is not owned by small media operators, it is not owned by the government, it is owned by large private conglomerate firms. And I think this puts an indelible influence on what American media can report and how American media can report what it reports. There's a space later in the lecture to develop this, so I won't go too much into it now, but the media has largely turned itself into a type of entertainment politics. And the reasons for that are simple. When the media needs to persuade us to pay attention so that it can sell advertising, we, of course, are going to have legitimate concerns and worries about the techniques it's going to use to keep us watching and the extent to which they will want to represent facts pertaining to the news in a calm, balanced, objective manner. I think the book chapter opens up in a very interesting way by referring to the fact that the media just simply doesn't want to ask complicated questions that will turn off the viewers. It so happens that after 9/11, many Americans were very emotional about what had happened, which is entirely understandable. But there also needed to be some very serious and important questions answered by experts about what had happened, about what we knew about who had done what to whom, and where the culprits may have been. The fact that, as the book reports, just prior to the 2004 election, 3/4 of people supporting George Bush believed that weapons of mass destruction had actually been found in Iraq, and that a similar percentage reported that Saddam Hussein, in their view, had supplied weapons to Osama bin Laden, and furthermore that 2/3 believed that Bush supported the Kyoto Treaty, the International Criminal Court, and the International Treaty banning landmines, all point to a dramatic problem with the way the media was doing its job. Because all of those assumptions we now know today were completely wrong. And it's not like we just found this out yesterday. In fact, we knew that those assumptions were wrong then as well. In fact, it was very, very clear early on that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. There has never been evidence produced of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. The little bits and pieces that were found pointed to weapons that had been used in the 1980s in the Iran-Iraq War and had since degraded. So, it's not for nothing that Colin Powell, the Chief of Staff, and then Secretary of State, said that the day that he went to the United Nations was the most shameful day in his life, which was the day that he was given intelligence information which was incorrect and suggested incorrectly that there were convoys moving around the Iraqi deserts trying to develop chemical weapons, etc. Colin Powell has disavowed that today and says that that was the most embarrassing day of his life, So clearly, most of the principals involved have completely distanced themselves from this claim, yet I suppose to this day many Americans still believe there were weapons of mass destruction found in Iraq. The book, and I would agree with the book in this regards, makes the argument that the reason why so many Americans clung at the time to the idea that there were WMD in Iraq was precisely because the media had not reported on the facts, and the media had not bothered to bring to people's attention the fact that these so-called facts that the government was reporting were in very dubious, to say the least. So in this, our first slide for today, we are going to talk about the ideal role of the media. We're going to try to discuss the media in relation to some of its sort of basic aspirational assumptions. Throughout this semester, we've been looking at the model of elite democratic perspective versus the popular democratic perspective. And in keeping with that, we're going to try to apply that perspective here today to the extent that we can. Now, as you know, we associate people like Thomas Jefferson with the popular democratic perspective to some extent. So we're going to talk about him in a minute. But we also associate Madison and Hamilton with the elite perspective. And the elite perspective back then, of course, in the day of the Founding Fathers, was much more aristocratic. Today it's not so aristocratic, I suppose, but more oriented towards defending principles of the marketplace, the free market specifically. And so what they tend to argue is that the important thing the media needs to do is basically have access to the most important thing the media needs is to be able to access what's going on the inside of politics. And so when I say on the inside, what that means is that the media should have ears inside the halls of government, and it should understand how to play the game so that it can get access to those halls of government. The media is a apparatus of the state government in some ways from the elite perspective, because its purpose is to transmit the arguments and the rationales for policy decisions to the masses and build public support for those. The problem, however, is that from their perspective, from the elite perspective, that media today might be a little bit too contrarian. It might be a little too incendiary, creating controversies, creating drama where perhaps it shouldn't be. And also perhaps the media today could be charged with spreading indecency. For example, one of the big complaints over the last decades has been the sort of collapse in standards for media behavior. And so when we think about the popular perspective, it's not so much the case that the popular perspective is an antithesis of that, that it's somehow that we should be spreading indecency, but rather that the values and views that the elite perspective advocates are somewhat, how should we say, pro or in favor of the status quo, right? The media should serve the government. The media should be a conduit for transmitting values and information from what the government's preferred positions are, and also should be a transmission or a conveyor belt for the values of a society. Now, the popular model in sort of breaking with that isn't trying to sort of say that anything goes. In fact, what it's saying is not that the media should be a vehicle for pretty much whatever people want to say, but rather that the media has to be an important check in the processes of democratic government, that the flow of information, if you will, should go two ways. And so for this reason, we quote Thomas Jefferson, who argued, "Were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter." Today, in fact, then the mass media have to be judged relative to this standard that Jefferson set up, right? The newspapers, the TV stations acting to challenge and to obstruct government in a responsible fashion that makes sure that government is acting in an accountable manner. The argument today from an elite perspective would not be that the problem is that there's indecency on the airwaves and that there's too much scandal or what have you, in which case sort of blaming the consumer, but rather that the corporate power elites themselves have gotten far too deeply into bed with the power elites that make our policy decisions, and that I've produced a kind of a I scratch your back, you scratch mine situation, whereby the government regulates the media in a manner that suits the owners of the media and allows them to consolidate their ownership of a lot of different media operations, giving them greater profits over time. And in exchange for this, the owners of the media give the government increasingly an easy time when it comes to debating what is going on in our current affairs. So the pluralists then, the people who today sort of hold up this Jeffersonian ideal of media responsibility, are very upset with the way the media is today. And they would argue that because the media is more concentrated in terms of its ownership, that at any time elsewhere in US history, it's only realistic to say that the media does indeed have a bias, that it tends to speak more and more with one voice, that it tends not to challenge government, whichever government is in the day, and it tends to sort of just basically ignore its responsibilities to ask the difficult questions. So a brief history of the US media then. In this slide, we ask the question of how the media sort of served in its early role or early function in US political history. We know that it has increased dramatically over the years. Around about the time of the founding of the American nation, it's fair to say that there weren't a lot of newspapers, and there was certainly no Twitter or Facebook, right? So the elites of the country, the people who were trying to shape the opinions, often turned to basic printing presses and hoped that they would get the people to read the various publications, and that the people would have views and opinions that were shaped by their encounter with these literatures. One example being the Federalist Papers that we've actually talked about before, wherein people like Madison and others tried to reach out to the masses to get them to sort of understand, but also support the various positions that were being articulated in relation to the Constitution that they were hoping that they would sign someday. And of course, technology's come a long way since then. And one of the problems with the early technology was that it, even though it was very thoughtful, it found it tremendously difficult to move information quickly over distance, and so it wasn't exactly up-to-the-minute information. When they spoke in slow, grand themes that spoke to generalities of life in the new colonies. They didn't necessarily have up-to-the-minute information about what was going on in the halls of power. Today, that problem has been largely overcome because the technology allows for instantaneous transmission of news. But in the same breath, while we have solved one set of problems, it's possible we've created new problems. And the big question, I think, for us in this class is whether the technology is creating these problems, or the system within which the technology is being used might be better said to be the problem. Are we sort of the slaves of technology, would be one way to put it, or are we technology's masters but using the technology perhaps inappropriately? In this slide we discuss some of the early history in the use and development of newspapers. On the one hand, we have the invention of the high-speed rotary press, which was a huge development, of course, because it allowed publishing in volume at lower costs. This is a highly mechanized, steam-driven system that allowed newspapers to be circulated over a very wide distance indeed. It led to sort of a standardization of texts in terms of what people were reading. 100 miles away, someone would be reading the same newspaper as you were. And of course, it also led to the emergence of a very broad audience and widely scaled or broadly scaled audience for newspapers. So some of the themes that emerge here then would be the idea that the newspaper could be used as a way to make money, as opposed to a way, unlike the Federalist Papers, just to shape public opinion. Another technological change that emerged around then was the development of the telegraph. which allowed for flow of information over great distances. So you could imagine, for the first time, not just having a printing press in New York, but having a printing press for the same newspaper in Philadelphia and in other cities. And that allows for the emergence of a truly global, truly national, newspaper product. Tremendously important if we want to understand the sociological significance of the development of modern newspapers. Another phenomena that is important then, if we want to understand this trend of not just the technology changing, but the scale of the readership changing in keeping with that, is how after the Civil War, these technologies lead to a huge burgeoning readership, which with also strong regional pressures for competition between different presses. Once you have those large audiences, you want to keep them. And so this is what we call yellow journalism. When the newspaper proprietors start to order their editorial rooms to print more and more sensational articles, dramatic articles, to try to bring people into their newspapers, to try to keep them hooked on reading the news. So editors would, as a result of this, slant the news to appeal to the popular imagination. And the objective, of course, is not to make money from sales. It's not that they want to sell more newspapers, because the newspapers are never going to make money just on what they sell. Newspapers actually really make money from advertising. Sales are just nominal figures to cut some costs. The real money is in advertising. So I guess some themes and questions emerge from the discussion of newspapers. You know, if originally America has opinion-shaping institutions like family, schools, political parties, what happens to those once the newspapers and the popular press start to get a hold of us? When newspapers first emerged after the War of Independence, they made no effort to be neutral. In fairness, they were essentially mouthpieces for different political agendas. But what they weren't was mouthpieces for scandal, right? I mean, they were basically not just selling newspapers for intrigue and advertising, and that's the thing I think that concerns us, because it's something that, while it goes away later on, it seems to be something that continues to characterize the way our television operates. In this slide you can see some of the evil spirits of modern daily press, and you can see them here, the little gremlin type things coming off the rotary press here. We have scandal, personal journalism, criminal news, hypocrisy, abuse, suggested offensiveness, paid puffery, bad pictures, garbage news. All of these things are coming off the printing press, and the question is, why are they coming off the printing press? They're coming off the printing press because this is the type of journalism that we see when the yellow press was at its heyday. With the advent of radio in the 1920s, we have some new developments to take account of. For the advent of print media, of course, you have information that can be transmitted anywhere in the world, but it's not necessarily a very personal or intimate way of communicating. Radio has the advantage of helping to create pictures in people's minds, and also they can listen to the radio while they're doing work, which means that it has a certain sort of facility of access that the print media doesn't have. Print media also presupposes literacy. And the advantage of radio for reaching the masses was not lost on American politicians. President Roosevelt was one of the first American presidents to really take up the advantage of radio, introducing what he called fireside chats. And in fact, since then, every president has used electronic media, especially radio, to communicate with the public. Even though the era of radio is over today, and perhaps President Obama might be more likely to use YouTubes, the principle of reaching out directly to the American people through technological means was established with Roosevelt. So combined then with newspapers and internet blogging and television, today we are truly in the age of mass media. But it's not just any old mass media. I want to make the argument to you that we have a specifically visual orientation in our media, despite radio. And I want to make that argument to you over the next couple of slides. The third advent, of course, is the one that we are most directly, I think, preoccupied with today, and that is television. Television was a game changer. One need only to consider the Kennedy versus Nixon election, which showed very, very starkly the kind of era that we were moving into. People who listened to the debate thought that actually Nixon had won that particular competition. In fact, people who watched the television version thought that Kennedy had won. And the question we have to ask is why that's so. How did the appearance of Kennedy versus the appearance of Nixon for the television viewers change their opinion relative to what people thought was going on when they were listening in on the radio? As it happens, Kennedy's campaign advisors had carefully prepared him for the powerful lights. They'd put makeup on him that would deflect and absorb some of the heat of those lights, and they also had a strong sense of how the whole visual medium worked overall. Nixon, on the other hand, was a very erudite politician, but he was not prepared for the debate in terms of his fidgeting. He was sweaty, and this is often said to have been a monumentally important occasion in American politics, for the simple fact that it was the first television-based election campaign. But of course, today we put a lot of faith in these television campaigns still, and we have, I think, some very serious and important questions we need to ask about how effective these debates are, about how effective the television medium is. The candidates, as we've said, are often coached. Their advanced teams often have the questions pre-agreed. So, while the viewers at home might get the impression of a spontaneous debate, in fact, it's usually anything but. In fact, at the runoff point, where the parties are trying to decide through the various primaries who should be the nominee for president, for example, there's a lot of monitoring and structured preparation that goes into those. And in fact, it's not clear at all who even gets to decide who gets to participate in those debates. One case study, for example, was that NBC News, which is owned by General Electric Corporation, rescinded its invitation to one of the Democratic candidates, Dennis Kucinich, and said that he didn't have enough support to be part of the primary debate. Well, in fact, he did have enough support to be part of the primary debate. What singled him out was the fact that he was the only Democrat at the time who was 100% against the war and 100% against war spending. And of course, GE, being a major profiteer from the war, had no interest in having a man like that on the presidential debate. It only wanted people who were going to debate the wherefores and whatnots of the war itself. So this is a real dilemma for those of us who have hopes and aspirations that democracy is thriving in the television era. So, having just talked about radio, newspapers, television, we can now talk about all of them together as the mass media, and we can offer some speculative remarks on how these technological developments may actually themselves be significant, not just insofar as they make it easier for people to read the message, right, the content, but actually that the form of the content transmission itself has a significance in its own right. In other words, It's not just the fact that the way we talk to each other changed, but the fact that the way we talk to each other changed is itself significant for how we do politics. So let me draw your attention to someone called Marshall McLuhan. Pictured here in the slide, he's the guy that invented the expression that you may have heard before, because it's not an uncommon expression, the medium is the message. He also invented the phrase the global village, which you may have heard before as well. But what do these phrases mean? Clearly, Marshall McLuhan's taken very seriously within the media analysis world. In popular cultural terms, he's sometimes thought of as the patron saint of information technology. Wired magazine named him thus. And what he did basically was try to develop an argument that changes in the media technology change actually how we think and thereby change who we are. He argued that, when you think about the early printing press, the Gutenberg press, for example, that allowed people to shift their frame of reference from an oral and oral culture, whereby people would have sat around a campfire perhaps to listen to the news of the day from their tribal elder or chieftain, and things might have been told in meaningful ways, stories of mystical spirits and whatnot, that gave the sense of the community to the people gathered. The Gutenberg press, the printing press, changed human beings, not just because it allowed them to get their news in a different way, but because it shifted them from being a group in their digestion of the media to being individuals, right? And so this is what Marshall McLuhan argues is the birth of a critical or specialist outlook. The fact that I have time to sit with the Bible, for example, the Gutenberg Bible, and think on my own about what these words mean and not have to listen to a priest lecture me on what the words mean, is bad news for things like the Catholic Church, a hierarchical or vertical organization specialized in interpreting the scriptures. In fact, says Marshall McLuhan, you'd never have had Protestantism without the invention of the privately printed printing press. That is to say, the copy that I have privately on my own. So this idea that you or I can be an expert on what we read is the mother of modern science, he argues, right? It's in fact the specialist outlook, that you and I can be a specialist in things, that is the gateway, sociologically speaking, through which human beings pass and must pass if they are to think of themselves as individuals first. That is to say, to care about themselves more as individuals than as members of a community. So I think that's pretty fascinating for what we're talking about here today. In this slide, we try to update some of Marshall McLuhan's points. Television, if anything, is the sort of absolute promise of Marshall McLuhan's visual culture writ large. In some ways, it makes us highly individualistic, right? Because if you think about it, even today, we can watch television on demand. We can watch it on our phones and on our tablets and laptops. So combining with the internet age, of course, the visual culture phenomena that Marshall McLuhan was speaking of is very relevant for our understanding of who we are sociologically. But if Marshall McLuhan was optimistic about the emergence of a specialist culture, if he was kind of giving us some sense of optimism in that, it's up to us, decades after his death, to look at the state of television and mass media today. Many critics argue that television is a soundbite medium, right? That people don't really have attention spans when they watch television. They turn the TV on and they kind of turn a little bit of their brain off. So it's a passive media, the television, right? And Marshall McLuhan's hopes were for something much more active when he was talking about the expert specialist outlook that we get from reading our own private copy of the Bible and having time to reflect on the words. He was not and did not have in mind the idea of a soundbite medium, right? So if the medium is the message, as Marshall McLuhan argued, then popular television, widespread circulation of television, might not be something that we should be grateful for. In fact, it's perhaps something we should be very cautious of. And in the following clip, and I'll just show you a bit of it now, but I want you to watch the rest of it online on your own, and I'll post the link for it separately to this lecture. You can see Jon Stewart of The Tonight Show, or The Daily Show, excuse me, arguing that, precisely this point, that as a comedian, in some ways, his TV product has become more soberly helpful in terms of giving us the news we need to make complex decisions about what policies we want to support that are being debated in government than actual news itself, which has become so sort of subverted by its own sort of status as a television product and so theatrical that it ceased to be relevant to the masses.
Very kind of you to say. Now what? Can I say something very quickly? Why do we have to fight? The two of you? Can't we just say something nice about John Kerry right now?
I like John. I care about John Kerry.
And something about President Bush.
He'll be unemployed soon.
I
made the effort anyway.
No, actually, I knew Bush in Texas a little bit, and the truth is, he's actually a great guy. He's not a very good president. He's actually a very good person. I don't think you should have to hate to oppose somebody, but it makes it easier.
Why do you argue? The two of you? I hate to see it.
We enjoy it.
Let me ask you a question.
Wait, let me ask you a question first.
All right.
Is John Kerry really the best? I mean, I think, John Kerry's done a terrible job.
I thought Lincoln was good.
Is he the best the Democrats can do?
Is he the best the Democrats can do?
Yeah, this year.
I'd always thought in a democracy, and again, I don't know, I've only lived in this country, that there's a process, what they call them primaries.
Right.
And they don't always go with the best, but they go with whoever won. So is he the best? According to the process.
Right.
So I'm going to let you watch the rest of that video on your own. I will put a link for it, as I said earlier on the Blackboard for you guys. And it's a very short video, but it's so rewarding to watch because even in the short bit that we were just able to watch now, you see very clearly how Tucker Carlson, and this is of course a clip from the TV show Crossfire, which got suspended after Jon Stewart's appearance because his criticisms were so pointed and direct that he kind of embarrassed the show's creators into shutting it down. It was of course a CNN show. But Jon Stewart goes on to talk at length about how the show is more about entertainment than about the facts, and of course Tucker Carlson was, in the little bit that we watched, was like going straight into this kind of, well, talk to me about John Kerry, and Jon Stewart's like, well, I don't really want to be on here as your kind of your liberal, your token liberal, or your token conservative. I don't want to be in those boxes. I want to be someone who can talk to you about what all this is, right? What this show is. So he proceeds to elaborate a very pointed critique of the show. So, obviously people like Jon Stewart are interesting because they are occasions, their comments are occasions for us to think critically about what's going on in the media today. In this table, we see some data that shows us how media consumption patterns of behavior have been changing over time. I think one of the big transformations has been the decline of radio and newspaper and the emergence of online sphere of communication. Many elite Democrats hold up the sphere of online communication as a tremendously great example of how the reliance on market forces can be a positive for our ability to get the information we need to make decisions as democratic citizens. Many people respond to that, however, and say that, well, not all voices are equal on the internet. And in fact, the presence of large corporate internet firms, CNN, New York Times, means that some sources are considered more legitimate than others, and that's not always the best thing if you're holding up that elite argument about the pluralization of voices online. Other changes and interesting sort of dynamics we can see emerging are how few people watch C-SPAN, which is one of the few sort of unfiltered, serious areas where we can get our news these days. We see CNBC declining, CNN declining, Fox News sort of holding its ground, and local TV news declining. Overall, the pattern seems to be one of declining news consumption, specifically local news consumption, and more specifically still, the collapse in newspaper and radio audiences. I think that's hugely important. So people clearly are, if they are getting their news, they're getting their news from these large conglomerate TV firms. Radio and newspapers are less important, and online media are clearly more important. The big question, I suppose, that this leads us to ask is, if we're going to talk about media bias, what is media bias? People on both sides of the spectrum claim that the media have an ideological or partisan bias. Some claim that the liberals dominate the media. Others claim that the media have a conservative bias. I think the facts probably are more clear that the media has a conservative bias, although I accept that probably the media has biases in both directions. One study, which I cite for you here, of ABC, CBS, and NBC news content in 2001 showed that 92% of all sources interviewed were white, 85% were male, and where identifiable, 75% were Republican. So what does that mean in terms of bias? It means that the news has a white, male, and Republican bias when it comes down to it. And of course, the classic white male conservative pictured here is none other than Bill O'Reilly himself. Also, more generally, and this is true year over year, liberals tend to get labeled as liberals on the media, right? So, you get invited on, if you're a conservative, you just get invited on as an expert. If you're liberal, you get invited on as a liberal commentator, right? And so this sort of should lead us to certain questions. Is there a liberal version of Bill O'Reilly out there? It's a tough one, right? I mean, you could say maybe Rachel Maddow, but I don't think she has the credentials somehow. You could say maybe a couple of other people, but none of them really seem to have the kind of firebrand status that Bill O'Reilly has, the sort of cranky, screaming version of a TV host. And so that should be a principal guide for us, the fact that it's so hard to think of a liberal Bill O'Reilly should be sort of, I think, clue number one. And also, I think another question that's important to ask at this juncture is, given that so many liberals and conservatives alike feel that we live in a depoliticized society whereby the data that we were looking at on the previous slide, which shows declining media consumption all across the board, what can we do in our present technological context to bring people back to reading about and thinking about politics? An important case study that I think I would offer to you guys is the case study of media consolidation. We've already established, I think, that the media has in general, white, male, and somewhat conservative agenda when we think about the type of guests that host our shows and the type of people that get invited on, the experts, so to speak, that get invited on. But we should also think about who owns the media. In December 2007, international media tycoon Rupert Murdoch bought the Wall Street Journal. And that meant that basically at that point in time, not only was he going to own a host of media products around the world, from The Economist to several British newspapers, he was now going to own Fox, Fox News, and Fox News Business. What was this going to do for independence in journalism? The Wall Street Journal, up to that point in time, had taken a fairly strong stance against Rupert Murdoch as a person and as someone wielding political influence through his media ownership. Okay, the Wall Street Journal argued that he had blurred a line that exists at many other U.S. media companies. a line intended to keep the business and political interests of owners from influencing the presentation of the news. This is a kind of a gentleman's agreement, if you will, that exists between owners of the media and the media editorial rooms, where the owner says, okay, I'm going to make money from this thing, but I don't want to abuse my status as an owner to give undue influence on what's going on in the newsroom. Rupert Murdoch has a long history of doing precisely the opposite of that. He uses his influence to shape the editorial line of the newspaper or television station in question. Up to that point in time, the Wall Street Journal had been owned by the Bancroft family, independently wealthy family, which actually had a different vision for the newspaper, one based on quality journalism. The Wall Street Journal today remains, I think, a quality journalistic enterprise. If you read its newspaper articles, they are quality and they're well researched. But editorially, if you read the op-ed section, it's become a very different newspaper. It's become a highly, highly conservative newspaper, and one that seeks constantly not so much to have a balanced debate of different points of view, giving the readership the chance to make their own mind up, but one that constantly pushes the conservative agenda. So earlier in the lecture, I made the point that one of the things that we could see is going on here was that a kind of a I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine attitude. And now that the influence of very narrow set of individuals over the media has become disproportionately large, at least compared to what used to pertain in the media ownership, we have to ask the question of how if the owners of the media are doing their part by not asking alienating questions and by not sort of digging deep to find out the facts, has government responded in kind to these efforts on the part of the media? And the answer is absolutely, right? Over the past 25 years, the number of media corporations has shrunk from 50 to just a handful. 80% of daily papers in the US are now owned by conglomerates. So these are the facts, and government, in exchange for these sort of developments and the fact that the media is giving such an easy time to government these days, introduces a relaxation of what's called the cross-ownership ban. Until 2006, newspapers were restricted from buying TV and radio stations in the same market. But in 2006, the Federal Communications Commission relaxed that policy, and to widespread criticism, it must be said. But it does beg the question of a cozy relationship now between the media owners and government itself. And it begs the question of how people like Jefferson, were they alive today, would perceive all of this. Would they be happy? Arguably not. So in keeping with that line of analysis, we can ask other questions about government influence on the media. We know that over the years the media have become quite unregulated in America. There are certain areas where the government will regulate. First, we should make a distinction between the print media and the broadcast media. The government does not regulate the print media very much. The broadcast spectrum is a bit more regulated. And so we can talk about the Federal Communications Commission, advent in 1934, which was given the power to regulate and license broadcasters to broadcast in the airwaves. And we also know that the broadcasting industry also has its own voluntary code of conduct for things like indecency and that kind of thing. The Telecommunications Act of 1996 is very important for us to discuss. Because under Title III of that Act, Bill Clinton argued and introduced legislation that anyone should be able to enter communications business, to let communications business compete in any market against any other. So if anyone's being let into the communications business, and if anybody in the newspaper business can now enter into, say, the television business, that is going to allow for cross-platform consolidation. meaning that a lot of different sort of players in the industry are going to have a ability to now shape each other across the different sectors. Your book also discusses the possibility in this very narrow media sphere for government misinformation. Dick Cheney, for example, among others, we've discussed this elsewhere, but we'll get back to it again later in the semester too. You know, the fact is the government went out of its way to plant a convenient argument in the mouths of the media, using a number of sources and channels to get the American people to believe that there was a connection between 9/11 and Saddam Hussein, when in fact there was none at all. And eventually we went to war in Iraq because of that, even though Iraq had pretty much nothing to do with 9/11. Another factor that we can consider is the Rolodex syndrome, whereby government advisors, when they retire, tend to be able to get jobs in the media as so-called experts. Karl Rove, for example, was a major public relations manager for the Bush White House, and then he became hired as an expert by Fox News, which suggested a very sort of relaxed and sympathetic relationship between Mr. Rove and Fox News, one that did not speak to Fox News's critical credentials in a very glowing light. So that's the Rolodex syndrome. We also can talk about source bias. As a recent example of source bias, The Nation magazine reported on September 15th in 2014 that many of the talking heads who had come on the television to promote the Obama administration's cause for bombing in Syria actually had ties to Pentagon contractors. To quote the piece, retired generals Jack Keane and Anthony Zinni and former Department of Homeland Security officials Francis Townsend have appeared on television recently, but their ties to military contractors were not disclosed. I think the problem is not that these people would be on television, but that they would be on television as independent and neutral experts. I think if you are going to invite them on television, you have to tell people who they are, and you have to tell people that the things that they are saying, that they have a vested interest in saying them. How else can these television stations represent these people as independent and neutral experts? We're going to go and bomb Syria. We are bombing Syria at the moment. So, you know, the question is, you know, are the American people being given adequate arguments on both sides of this equation? And if they are not, how can they be able to make their own minds up? Thomas Jefferson's ideal was for an active population that was engaged in reading and understanding the media. If that's not happening, then we have a problem. So in this slide, and we're coming towards the end of our lecture now, we're going to talk about a current controversy, which is the controversy of network neutrality. And this is also really to do with government influence on how the media are regulated. It's important, as we've discussed, that the media are regulated in terms of television and radio broadcasting, but the internet is so new that it's not always obvious or clear how it should be regulated. But there's been a strong interest on the part of the major cable providers to not just take money from the subscriber, that is you or I sitting at home paying for our internet service, but also to be able to charge certain types of content providers for the types of content that they are broadcasting. So for example, I might have a website that has my blog on it, but Netflix has a website that has huge movies on it. And according to the principle of network neutrality, both those different types of data should be given the same pass, the same privilege to travel on the railway networks, if you will, of the cyberspace networks. I use the railway metaphor there deliberately because, in fact, network neutrality was a principle that was established in the 19th century in the regulation of rail networks. And then it was the idea that, you know, if I'm moving coal from one company on a train, Just because you own the networks doesn't mean that you can't deny me access to your railway. I should be able to pay to access your railway just as anyone else. My train should be able to run over your railway system just as anyone else's if they pay the fee, and the fee should not be discriminatory. Well, similarly here, the principle would be that one person's blog should be given the same type of access that another person's Netflix movie has access to, right? So that's what network neutrality means. And the basic idea is that it prevents, if you have that principle in place, it prevents large service providers from being able to use their power over the last mile, that is the bit from the internet backbone, which is, say, shall we say, public domain, right? But where it comes from the sort of fiber optic cable of your town, from there to your house is usually owned by the service provider, the cable provider. And that's really where the cable companies are interested in making money, because they want to be able to charge the heavy-duty providers like Netflix more for the privilege of having faster streaming content on their bandwidth. What's really interesting is that while the telecommunication companies are obviously motivated by a desire to profit from the control of the internet pipeline, so to speak, a host of people have come out allied against it that you wouldn't necessarily think belong together in the same political field. Just have a look at the advocates defending network neutrality here. Christian Coalition, the Teamsters, PETA, video gamers, the ACLU, the NRA, and more, right? When was the last time you saw the National Rifle Association allied with the unions, right? Usually those two people do not make the best friends. Yet in this particular instance, because they realize that if you start creating unequal citizenship for data on the internet, some getting slowed down because it hasn't paid the fee, others getting sped up because they paid more money, like extra money for that privilege, then you have trouble. The inventor of the internet, Vint Cerf, argued the following. He said the internet was designed with no gatekeepers over new content or services. This goes back to this idea, of course, that the internet was designed by the military to be able to withstand attacks on a communication infrastructure. If one node in your infrastructure is taken out, you can still communicate via other nodes around. That's the basis of the internet. It's a principle called packet switching. So Vint Cerf is referring to this when he said that that's the point the internet was designed with in mind, that you shouldn't be able to have gatekeepers. What he argues for is a lightweight but enforceable neutrality rule. He says it's needed to ensure that the internet continues to thrive. Last but not least, we have to talk about the impact of social media on the internet, and the internet specifically in relation to campaigns. I want to draw your attention to a book here by a man called Joe Trippi, who was Howard Dean's campaign manager when Howard Dean had his famous yeehaw moment, right? Many people remember Howard Dean for the yeehaw moment, where he sort of, in a very dramatic fashion, exploded on a stage to rally his troops, having won the New Hampshire primary. But the true reason we should remember Howard Dean, argues Joe Trippi, is because he changed the way the internet was used for campaigning. Of course, it makes sense that candidates today use websites to get their message out, as well as to solicit contributions. But Howard Dean took these principles and took them to the next level. He was the one that invented the idea of using social networking principles to help average people feel like they are part of a campaign. And in fact, it was his ideas really that subsequently went on to form the backbone of the Obama campaign in 2008. And as we know, since 2008, many advocacy groups like MoveOn.org have really become very major players, political players, through utilizing the internet. We also have a number of political blogs that are taken very seriously today, like Daily Cost and Informed Comment. Of course, using blogs, using social networking technology to facilitate political power has pros and cons. On the one hand, it certainly seems that it makes people feel like they are more involved. On the other hand, though, I think it's safe to say that it comes with serious negative externalities. I go back, for example, to the Coney 2012 campaign, which many of you may remember, where people thought that by simply clicking a like button on Facebook, that they were actually somehow contributing money, resources, or showing support for a campaign that on the surface of things looked like it was trying to help poor children survive the ravages of a tyrannical dictator in Uganda by the name of Joseph Kony. However, when we looked more closely at that story, it turned out that that was what some people call today clickbait. In fact, the support that they were getting online for their cause, the money that was flowing to that organization to try to fight Joseph Kony, was misrepresenting several facts about what it was up to. And so I think this is hugely problematic. More recently this year, we've seen the advent of a plan to take the Ice Bucket Challenge, a campaign to take the Ice Bucket Challenge. Many people unified came together to celebrate and to support the idea of overcoming a terrible disease by the name of ALS by pouring buckets of water over themselves and donating money to charity to show their support for that. And it was truly very, very popular this summer on the internet. However, a lot of money was contributed to that activity, and it's not clear that the money that was contributed to that activity reflected the social utility that that money might otherwise be sort of leading us to think was required or not. Forgive me, I'm missing my words there a little bit, but what I mean to say is, in fact, if you looked at the amount of people that died from ALS in last year, you would see that it was not really a very grave threat to human welfare compared to, say, heart disease. Yet we don't raise money for heart disease. We raise money for ALS, we raise money for breast cancer, even though ALS and breast cancer are not really killers. So why are certain diseases considered by the masses to be urgent diseases when they're not killing as many people? It's a tough question to understand and to explore and to answer, but social media has a lot to do with it. And the question then is whether clicking on things on the internet actually is helpful for our democracy and for the way we assign resources like money to fix problems. So many people would argue a better way to combat our healthcare system would be to give the government a strong tax revenue that it can use to measure and to study how people are dying and where people need help. If glitzy social media campaigns like Kony and the Ice Bucket Challenge get our attention so easily, but are actually not that important in the greater scheme of things, although that's not very comfortable for someone who has ALS to hear, the reality is we'd be doing a lot more people a lot more favors if we worked and spent money on on heart disease and things like that, than on breast cancer and Susan Komen and things like this. So that's just sort of the downside of using the internet as a form of political intervention and advocacy. So okay, guys, I'll see you on Thursday, and I will look forward to seeing your journals and catching up with you then. All right, be good and talk to you then.